Alive is a South Korean film from 2020, which presents us with a scenario of immediate and absolute collapse. One that came without warnings and without a recognizable point of origin. Simply, one day the world as we knew it ended. Seoul, a city with almost 10 million inhabitants, woke up to an inexplicable chaos that spread so quickly that even emergency services became completely overwhelmed. What at first seemed like an isolated incident in one district of the city transformed within hours into the complete fall of the country. Social media became saturated with desperate messages, the news outlets failed to report what was happening at first, and the streets turned into corridors of panic where no one knew what was happening. At 11:28 in the morning, Oh Jun-woo watches from the window of his apartment as the everyday life he knew begins to crumble before his eyes. Without intending to, he had become a direct witness to the apocalypse. What he saw were people attacking each other for no reason, screams coming from every direction, and bloody bodies moving erratically and violently. In its first hours, the infection was an absolute mystery. The film gives no scientific explanation or official statements like many other zombie apocalypses from other universes do. The government's official communications, fragmented and almost useless, only managed to mention an extremely contagious viral infection capable of attacking the central nervous system with a speed impossible to contain. Some transmissions allude to severe damage in brain structures associated with rational control, especially the right hemisphere. This would explain the immediate loss of higher cognitive functions seen in the infected. Because of this, the result is a human being stripped of consciousness, dominated only by primary impulses such as hunger and rage. The progression of the virus is so fast that it eliminates any possibility of immune defense. Something notable about this virus is that there is no prolonged fever or recognizable incubation period. This infection acts in just minutes. Victims suffer violent spasms, as if their own bodies were trying to resist the process. The capillaries in the eyes burst, causing bleeding around the eyelids, and their corneas become opaque and milky. The veins darken, the skin adopts greenish or gray tones, and the muscles tense severely. Basically, this virus caused immediate, brutal, and irreversible physical deterioration. The most terrifying thing is that, while losing their humanity, they retain fragments of muscular and mechanical memory, such as movements, reflexes, and habits they performed in life. This explains why an infected person could open doors or even climb structures with agility that would have been impossible before. That combination of uncontrollable aggression and retained memory made these infected far more dangerous than the common zombie. Because of this, within hours, Seoul became unrecognizable. Its streets, once full of people and vehicles, turned into empty scenes where only abandoned cars, blaring sirens, and the first signs of a country heading toward total destruction remained. Furthermore, as newscasts disappeared one by one, so did the sense that there was any authority capable of controlling this crisis. Government messages, increasingly brief and scattered, were limited to insisting on absolute isolation as the only means of survival. Oh Jun-woo, trapped in his apartment, began to understand that he was alone and that no one else would come to help him. From his window, he observed the collapse of the world like someone watching a fire from a distance, unable to help, forced only to resist and hope for the best. Even though he tried to communicate with his family, phone lines collapsed quickly. Text messages were sent, but there was no way to know if they reached their destination. Only on rare occasions did he manage to receive a response from his mother, who begged him not to go out, to stay locked in no matter what he heard outside. The food in his apartment was limited, and he began to ration what little remained carefully, knowing he had no idea how many days he would have to endure. But very soon water stopped flowing from the pipes. In a desperate act, he began to drink alcohol to trick the sensation of thirst, knowing that this could not sustain him for long. Loneliness, combined with hunger and dehydration, became an enemy as dangerous as the infected outside. Outside, and as the hours passed, the behavior of the infected became increasingly erratic and dangerous. They began grouping in hordes that reacted in a synchronized way to noises, light, or movement, running with great aggression. Some seemed capable of ignoring secondary stimuli as soon as they detected prey, as was the case with those who attacked the female officer. As time went on, the days lost their meaning, and transformed into an endless sequence of hunger, fear, and silence. Without electricity and without signals from the outside, darkness became his constant companion. Every noise in the hallway, every shadow passing in front of his window, was a reminder that any attempt to go out would end in certain death. In the midst of that absolute darkness, Oh Junwoo began to lose his sense of self. Survival no longer depended on how much food he could ration or how many days he could remain silent, but on resisting the slow, mental erosion caused by isolation. With the power cut and the total lack of stimuli, his thoughts became an increasingly narrow prison. Loneliness, already unbearable, pushed him into dangerous places. In his moments of greatest weakness, he imagined seeing his family again, only to return to reality and fall into a deep depression. He thought that perhaps there was no reason to continue in a world that had stopped making sense. Although unexpectedly, he received a notification from his phone. He tried to get signal by extending the phone out the window, clinging to the hope of hearing what was left of the message. But what he managed to do was attract dozens of infected beneath his building, all looking upward like animals waiting for their prey to fall by mistake. What he received was a voice message from his parents, distorted among screams. At this point, something inside him broke. With a great anger inside, Oh Junwoo confronted the zombies outside his apartment, but he was quickly overwhelmed by the horde, forcing him to run back to his home. Shortly after, on day 20 of the apocalypse, Oh Junwoo saw from his window how massive explosions destroyed the city. It was in that instant, completely overwhelmed, that he made the darkest decision: to end everything. He had reached a point where continuing seemed equivalent to prolonging unnecessary suffering. But just before taking the final step, a red dot appeared on his face. A laser. Someone was watching him. Instinctively, he turned his head toward the window and discovered that across the street, in a neighboring building, a woman was holding a laser pointed at him. Kim Yoo-bin, another survivor. That small red glimmer was enough to tear through the darkness, consuming him. It pushed him to fight to free himself from the knot and cling to life again. Despite the spark of hope that Kim Yoo-bin had ignited in him, a question lingered in the air. What exactly was that virus that had devastated Korea within hours? The film never offers definitive answers, but it hints at a series of subtle details that allow speculation about its possible origin. The first theory that many viewers considered points to a failed experiment. Signs of this appear in the government's early reaction, such as the almost immediate broadcast cuts, prolonged silences in official statements, and an abrupt military presence in key locations. This seemed too coordinated for a common outbreak appearing out of nowhere. It was as if the government already knew what was happening, or worse, what was about to happen. Several brief reports mentioned biological containment protocols, a phrase that went unnoticed by most, but which suggested an internal incident, something created, manipulated, or stored inside a laboratory that had escaped scientific control. Although that was not the only possible explanation. Shortly before the final blackout, Oh Junwoo managed to hear a report that spoke about ultra-fine dust reaching critical levels in Seoul. These microscopic particles, which in real life are capable of penetrating deeply into the lungs and even reaching the bloodstream, were at their highest levels in the days prior to the collapse. Some fans speculate that this dust could have been the perfect vehicle for a modified pathogen to spread easily. A virus that moved through the air would explain not only the speed of the contagion, but also why the infection spread simultaneously in different parts of the city with no visible initial focus. The third theory is the least likely, but also the most unsettling: contamination in food. Before everything fell apart, Junwoo's mother had explicitly asked him to go out and buy supplies. He decided not to and stayed at home, a choice that seemed insignificant at the time, but that retrospectively could have saved his life in several ways. The first is that by not going out, he was not caught in the initial chaos in the streets, giving him the chance to actually understand what was happening. And the second is that if the supply chains, supermarkets, or even the drinking water had been compromised, thousands could have become infected without realizing it, sharing contaminated products in a city where daily life depended on convenience and speed. Although, as I said earlier, this is the least likely one, since we saw the protagonist drink tap water and consume his provisions without consequence. Although these three theories are not mutually exclusive, since they could coexist and be pieces of the same puzzle, the only certain thing is that, regardless of its origin, the virus had transformed Korea into a territory where surviving no longer depended on understanding what had happened, but on staying alive one more day. Kim Yoo-bin would become, from that moment on, the only ally against the apocalypse. They did not speak yet, but her presence had already begun to change him. For the first time in days, he did not feel like a ghost in his own home. Now Oh Jun-woo knew that, on the other side of the street, there was someone else resisting just like him. With hope newly recovered, Oh Jun-woo leaned out the window with a mix of disbelief and relief. The woman with the laser raised her hand in a minimal gesture, but enough to confirm that it was not a hallucination. The following day, they began communicating using simple signs, gestures, their electronic devices, and the limited visibility offered by their windows. Although they were separated by a street full of infected, the distance did not prevent them from cooperating. Yoo-bin, organized and meticulous, seemed to have spent days studying the movements of the zombies and evaluating the inhabitable floors of her building. When she noticed that Jun-woo was practically out of food, Yoo-bin improvised a way to help him. She tied a rope to a baseball and threw it toward the other building, trying to get it to reach his balcony. But the force was not enough, and the rope ended up on the street. Oh Jun-woo remembered his drone and used it to tie the end of the rope and bring it to his window. Thanks to that improvisation, they established a sort of supply line between their apartments. But something didn't take long to go wrong. While Yoo-bin was looking out from her balcony, unaware, a zombie had taken the rope from the street, which was tied to a table in her apartment. It pulled it with force, which caused the table to shoot forward and strike Yoo-bin, leaving her briefly unconscious. This infected, who in life had been a firefighter, began climbing the building using the thin rope, showing not only his skill, but the almost superhuman strength he now had. Oh Jun-woo, helpless from his balcony, watched as the creature advanced toward Yoo-bin's apartment. Desperate, he tried to distract it by throwing bottles in the drone, bringing it close to the zombie in an attempt to divert its attention. But the zombie simply ignored them, which again demonstrated what I mentioned earlier. These zombies become selective once they have prey within reach. Although Oh Jun-woo's efforts were not in vain, in the few seconds he managed to distract the infected were enough for Yoo-bin to regain consciousness. With a quick movement, she grabbed her axe and cut off the firefighter's hand, making the infected fall from several floors up. This showed them that the zombies were much more dangerous than they seemed, and that they would have to be much more careful from now on. Additionally, Oh Jun-woo understood that staying locked in was no longer a viable option. Food was scarce, water would not return, and the available resources could barely sustain him for a few more days. It was then that he made the decision to risk leaving his apartment in search of supplies. Carefully, he opened the hallway door, fearing he would find an infected on the other side, but silence accompanied him. He took advantage of that brief moment of calm and went to the neighboring apartment, convinced that perhaps his neighbor had left something useful behind. Upon entering, he discovered the lifeless body of a woman on the bed. He did not know who she was, since she did not match the neighbor or his brother, whom Oh Jun-woo already knew. That detail unsettled him, but before he could analyze her, a growl behind him made him turn. The neighbor's brother, now completely transformed, lunged at him violently. In a reflex movement, Oh Jun-woo used the body as a shield and ran back toward his apartment. Despite this, his effort was not in vain, since he found food there, 2 walkie-talkies, and some equipment that would be useful later. That small victory allowed him to continue helping Yoo-bin and fueled, even if just a little, his determination. However, danger did not take long to return. One morning, they both heard the frantic movement of dozens of infected, running simultaneously in both directions of their buildings. It was as if something had provoked them suddenly. Yoo-bin, upon grabbing her axe, accidentally knocked down a shelf, and the noise caught the attention of an entire horde that began moving toward her apartment. It was then that Jun-woo demonstrated his ingenuity once again and called the landline phone of the apartment next to Yoo-bin's, causing the horde to divert toward that door. A simple but effective trick, but escaping could no longer be postponed. Yu-bin, calculating the risks, deduced that the 8th floor of her building was clear. If they managed to get there, they could regroup and look for a way out. She, being the one most physically prepared, went down the rope from her balcony and pushed her way through the infected in the street, who were slowly cornering her. Junwoo ran to help her when she was about to be caught, and together they entered the building, using the elevator as a last option to buy time. Upon reaching the 8th floor, they were attacked again by the horde that almost caught Junwoo, although they found something unexpected. Another survivor who distracted the zombies with a smoke bomb and let them into his apartment. His apparent kindness and the food he offered hid much darker intentions. Because he kept his wife, transformed into a zombie, locked up, refusing to accept her death, and feeding her had become his twisted way of keeping her alive. The water and the food were contaminated with sedatives. Unfortunately for them, they realized this far too late. Both of them fell unconscious. Yu-bin was dragged into the room with the infected woman and left there to be devoured. While the effect did not last long on Junwoo, who grabbed his revolver and threatened their attacker with it, although he dropped it to save his companion. Yu-bin, determined, managed to subdue the infected woman and used her to attack her husband just as he opened the door. In a heartbreaking scene, the transformed wife turned against her own husband, sealing the fate of both. But in an act of compassion, Yu-bin fired the revolver, ending both of their lives. Although all this noise attracted the horde, knowing that there would be no escape this time, they prepared to use the weapon on themselves. Although at the last moment, they heard the sound of approaching helicopters, realizing that there was no other way out but the rooftop. Fighting their way through dozens of zombies, they managed to reach it, though they ended up cornered, with no bullets and no strength, only waiting for the end, although luckily it did not come. Behind them, the rescue helicopter had arrived, and the soldiers inside mowed down the infected who were about to reach them. Junwoo and Yu-bin, exhausted but clinging to life, boarded their salvation together. In the end, Junwoo checked his phone and found those missed calls from his family, whom we never knew if they managed to survive. But we also discovered something else. His post at the beginning of the outbreak, that desperate message he posted not knowing if anyone would read it, ended up being the reason why the helicopter arrived at his building, since it was enough for the authorities to confirm that there were still survivors there. And thus concludes the story of Alive, a movie that at the time I couldn't cover, but that is one of the most grounded in our reality, especially in the use of social media. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all my new videos. I also want to give a special shout out to the channel members. Thanks to you and all of our viewers, we can keep diving into these kinds of disturbing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, early videos, and other perks, I invite you to become a member. Just click the join button below this video. See you in the next one. Hey, don't go just yet. If you enjoyed this video, I've got another one I think you'll love. Check it out.